Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit. What you're about to hear is an editorial. That means it's an opinion piece. As simple as that. It's not an op-ed. The meaning of op-ed is something that I even screw up every once in a while because, frankly, op-ed, which used to mean opposite of editorial page and now means opinion editorial, is usually written by somebody who is not part of the publication. Something more of a guest speaker. That in itself has some problems. These outside sources are generally not vetted, and as a result, they may have connections, friendly connections, fiscal connections to various people, various causes, and various companies. So when they write something like this that's influential, there could be problems with conflict of interest. It's entirely possible. But this is simply an editorial, which is what plenty of websites write, it's what plenty of YouTubers do. And it's an opinion, which is what many people claim a review is. And to some degree, of course, they are correct. The notion that a review could be 100% objective is obviously silly. The experiences, personal preferences, and bias of the reviewer are going to be a key part of said review. And over the last few months, we've heard a great deal on what should and should not be part of review text. Should political opinions be kept out of game reviews? Should scores be determined without consideration to said opinions? Should scores even still exist at all in 2014? This video is going to be my opinion of just that. Now, I think we're all fairly familiar with the standardized form of review. We look at traditional games media over the last few years. They tend to do reviews in two ways. Firstly, they'll do a written review, which will of course be several paragraphs, sometimes even 2 pages, and at the bottom there'll be a conclusion and generally a score, possibly followed by a score breakdown. Some of these sites also do video reviews. In some cases, these video reviews are merely readings of their written reviews, with B-reel in the background, so they last about 3 or 4 minutes. Sometimes there will be a separate video review created by the site itself, usually anywhere between 5 to 10 minutes. That's the traditional review format. Now, of course, there are other formats that some people like to bundle into the term review as an overall umbrella, and you know very well that I don't like that happening. Find it very annoying. I like nuance. I like to be able to distinguish one thing from another. I like accuracy in description. But things like Giant Bomb Quick Looks and WTF Is, and to some degree even First Impressions live streams, are all being rolled under this review banner. Ultimately, what is the purpose of a game review? Well, generally speaking, a game review is a buyer's guide. It is a guide to the consumer as to whether or not a game is worth purchasing. That's the most reductive way, I suppose, of describing it, because it is what the vast majority of viewers online use them for. Now, that's not to say that that's all a review can be, but it is the most common form of review when it comes to this particular industry, and I would argue it's also the most useful. There are plenty of other ways of reviewing a product in film, in literature, in food. There are various types of review that border on academic, and that kind of criticism is designed for a different audience and a different purpose. Video games do have that, but not to a particularly great extent, and honestly, if they did, those would be the kind of sites that would be very niche. There's nothing wrong with that, and indeed, that's the sort of thing that you might be wanting to look at a patronage model to support, because you're aiming your content at a very specific niche audience that may be willing to pay for that because that content is few and far between, and when it is written, it's often not very good, because the people doing it are frankly simply not qualified to do so. It's a real shame, honestly, because I think there is a place for that particular brand of critique, and I would love to read more of it. But the place that I don't go to find it would be the regular traditional product review. I find that if you're going to slap a score on something, the chances are that you are not even pretending to come close to academic critique, and that's good. But every now and again, we do see reviews perhaps overreach in the eyes of some readers, and that's what I'd like to talk about today. I'd like to talk about the way that reviews are constructed, and where the line should, if ever, be drawn when it comes to injecting political or personal opinion into a review, and of course taking on the whole idea of objectivity. Let's talk about that first. So the straw man that's been bandied around a great deal is that people are looking for 100% objective reviews. This is an easy straw man to take to pieces because 100% objective reviews don't actually exist. If you read Jim Sterling's 100% objective review that he wrote a little while ago about Final Fantasy XIII, then you'll see exactly why such things do not exist. That said, the whole notion is pretty much a straw man. I don't believe that anyone really thinks that they want 100% objective reviews. What they want is something just a little bit different. I feel that the subjectivity of opinion when it comes to reviews is often used as a shield to deflect criticism of that particular piece of writing. Subjectivity is, of course, an absolutely huge factor when dealing with reviews. There's no real doubt about that. You're not going to escape it, and if I'm going to be honest, you don't want to escape it. I think you're going to get a much better variety of reviews if you accept the fact that they are going to be subjective, but that does not give letter of the mark to go 100% subjective. The thing about games critique is that games are very unique in terms of their medium, and there are many things which can be criticized on an objective or at least very close to objective level because we're dealing with a very technical product. It's a piece of software. Pieces of software work to varying degrees. It's very rare, for instance, for a movie to fail to film the thing that it's aiming the camera at. That would be, of course, an objective black mark against that film, but those films don't really exist. Yet there are plenty of games that exist with very similar problems, whether it be performance-related or simply in a set of broken game mechanics. Even then, one cannot be 100% objective. If you're criticizing performance, well, some people are entirely fine with 30 frames per second and will notice that those people tend to be more forgiving on the performance end of things. On the other side, there are people like me that want all games to run at 144 frames per second for my 144 Hz monitor. So I'm kind of on the other end of that. I expect, with a very high-end PC, that I should be able to run games at a high frame rate with high detail. And I put a lot of importance on that. I'm a person that believes that anything that's running below 60 frames per second is subpar. I do not believe that 30 frames per second is acceptable. I would also go as far as to say that 60 frames per second is objectively better than 30 frames per second, and I have a number of reasons for believing that, but even then, you're going to have some people question the objectivity of that statement. Some people will argue for the whole cinematic vision thing, which as far as I'm concerned is very easily debunked, but others will say, well, actually, 60 frames per second just looks too smooth for me. Are they wrong? Well, no. I mean, I find their criticism kind of silly, but they're not wrong. That's a very subjective preference, and you can't just debunk that. You can try and teach people that actually there are a bunch of benefits to playing in 60, and perhaps maybe your preference is based on a lack of experience, or just overexposure to 30 frames per second gaming, or maybe even just a misunderstanding of the facts. Annoyingly enough, some games media folks actually seem to buy in to the 30 frames per second cinematic argument and will make silly comparisons like, well, people didn't like The Hobbit at 48 frames per second, as if that would somehow be applicable to video games. And it's not. We've been gaming on 60 frames per second for decades now, so it's a little weird to hear that come out, but again, that seems like a subjective preference that is driven by objective misunderstanding. But it's still a subjective preference, and it's very hard to argue against it. You can't just say to someone, well, your opinion is wrong in that respect. Maybe you do prefer 30 FPS. I'm not inside your brain. I can't explain whether or not you really believe that. So that's the problem with objectivity and subjectivity when it comes to reviews, but the big misunderstanding that I think a lot of people make, especially those that deliberately use the objective review straw man in order to deflect criticism, is this. When people ask for objective reviews, they are not asking for 100% objectivity, they are asking for the pursuit of objectivity. You can never 100% achieve objectivity with a review, but you can pursue it to the best of your ability, and that means attempting, where relevant, to either disclose or put aside your personal biases. That does not mean that you cannot express your opinion, far from it. What it does mean is that you should attempt to contrast your opinion with those of others and put yourself in the shoes of other people. Now this is where some of the controversy comes in, and for this example we're going to be contrasting a couple of reviews from Polygon. Now, the reason I'm using Polygon as a source is because in a recent letter from the editor, Christopher Grant revealed for all intents and purposes that Polygon is a progressive site on the political scale. Now, those of you in the UK might be scratching your heads a bit, or indeed anywhere else in the world that's not American. That's kind of a big problem with a lot of the recent arguments, is that we're dealing with a very Americentric political viewpoint, which is very confusing to those of us outside the US, or that, of course, grew up in different countries. When I look at the political spectrum over in the US, I see right-wing and more right-wing arguing with each other, whereas some people in the US believe that there are genuine left and right political divides in the United States. It's a very odd thing to see from an outside perspective, because we look at it and we say, well, actually it seems like all your politicians are pretty right-wing in comparison to our politicians. And that affects all the discourse on the internet. And this is similar to saying that you are a progressive games review site on the political spectrum. I couldn't actually tell you what that means, because progressive in the UK does not mean the same as progressive in the US, in Germany, in Sweden, in France, in South Korea. The term is frankly nebulous and relatively meaningless and not particularly helpful as far as I'm concerned. But Polygon has disclosed that that is their particular political leaning. And I have no problem with websites, particularly in games, having political leanings. We have such things in every other form of media. That should be the case. But I would also, of course, like that to be very clearly disclosed. Now, I'd like to contrast the review of Dragon's Crown, which was reviewed by Danielle Rindow, I believe that's how you pronounce it, in July of 2013, and Bayonetta 2, which was reviewed by Arthur Geese on October the 13th of 2014. Now, the Bayonetta 2 review received some flack. The Dragon's Crown review got a little bit as well. Last year, I created a video about Dragon's Crown where I defended that particular reviewer's right to say what she said about the depiction of women in that game. Now, if we move on to the Bayonetta 2 review, what are the differences here? I don't particularly like the Bayonetta 2 review, and I'd like to explain why compared to the Dragon's Crown review, which I personally found to be okay. And before I go into this, I would like to remind you that this is simply an editorial piece of opinion. I have no intention of attempting to police the reviews of other websites. I don't have the power to do so, but I can certainly express my opinion on how they're written and how personal politics are injected into each. Now, the way that the Dragon's Crown review dealt with the representation specifically of NPC women in that game was, in my opinion, very well balanced and proportionate to the rest of the review. It was essentially put in a box out, which is a good place to put very specific pieces of information that generally don't flow well with the rest of the review. It's an awesome place to put very specific opinions that may not necessarily be shared by the audience and are perhaps very particular to the reviewer themselves. And it was also mentioned in the conclusion. Now, there were plenty of other things mentioned in the review that led to a final score of 6.5, which I felt to be fair, bearing in mind that there were a variety of other concerns expressed within that review itself. So I didn't really feel that the political leanings, if you can call the depiction of women a political leaning, I guess it is, according to Polygon, that thinks that that is progressive politics, whatever you want to call it, I don't think that really influenced the score too much. It didn't seem like that was the case. And I'd also say that the reviewer did a good job in that case, to some degree, of distinguishing between the notion that the main characters were sexist and the idea that actually, well, they're powerful women with agency, so it's possible that you wouldn't interpret these characters as sexist. Now, she did go on to claim that the female NPCs were barely clothed with heaving chests, so very much fell into the damsel trope, presented as helpless objects in need of rescue. She described it as obvious, one-sided, and gross. And I really don't like terms like gross. I find them particularly childish. What does gross actually mean? You know, it seems to be a nice catch-all term for something that I didn't really like all that much. And it does tie a little bit too closely, I think, into this idea of trying to either shame a developer or indeed the consumer for enjoying a particular piece of media if it happens to be eroticized in some way. But overall, I think that that review did a really good job of explaining the game, also explaining a concern that the reviewer had, but not going completely overboard with it. And this ties in nicely to what I was saying earlier. When you are writing a review, obviously your personal experiences and your opinions are going to be a huge factor there, but as far as I'm concerned, you still need to make a decent effort to look in from outside, look through the window, put yourself in the shoes of others, because your ultimate goal is to serve the consumer, in my opinion. I've built my entire business on this very idea, that everything I create is not for me, it's for the consumer. And I need to try and detach myself from my own personal opinions from time to time. I can still use them heavily, and I do. But if I have biases, those are the things that I should be disclosing to my audience and wearing on my sleeve, so that those that come to watch my critiques are made aware in advance of the kind of biases that I'm going to be holding. And I usually use the long-form nature of said videos to convey that point, whereas written media is very limited. A lot of these Polygon reviews are anywhere between 1,000 to 1,500 words, and the video review, which was a reading of the Dragon's Crown review, lasts for 3 minutes and 10 seconds. I can say a lot more in 50 minutes than this person can in 3, and that's why I like to use my videos to expand on the discussion and try and look at it from different points of view. Even with something like Borderlands, which I will flat out say I absolutely hate, I try to think, well, what about if I really enjoyed Borderlands 2? What if I had actually got hundreds of hours going here? What is there here for me? Because that's going to be a significant chunk of your viewership. I can't just go around saying, I hate Borderlands, and assume that that's useful to the consumer. I mean, that is useful to some consumers, but I'm trying to cast as wide a net as possible, and the way that I do that is to look at things from different points of view where possible. I probably won't be able to do it perfectly, because I'm going to be able to explain a point of view that I hold much better than a point of view that I do not, but you should be giving it a try, frankly. And that's where I go on to the Bayonetta review. Now, I'd like to point out that, similar to the video that I did last year where I contrasted the Dragon's Crown review to a Leisure Suit Larry Reloaded review written on Eurogamer in 2013, which I thought was an absolutely terrible review because it was essentially a shame piece more so than anything else that gave me very little information on the game and made a lot of very authoritative statements about what is and is not sexist, and even went as far as to judge the people that backed the Kickstarter. Now, that to me was a terrible review, whereas contrasted to the Dragon's Crown review, which I thought was much more balanced and much more understanding, while still able to hold a particular point of view. Now, I don't think the Bayonetta 2 review by Arthur was anywhere near as bad as that Leisure Suit Larry review, but it's very front-loaded. I was actually surprised. I read this review a little while ago, and then I read it again to research for this video, and I was surprised to find there was actually a lot less of the sexism criticism in the particular review than I thought there was in the first place, which I guess indicates just how dominant that particular point was, mostly because it's what he led with, and it was what several paragraphs were dedicated to before even really describing any of the game mechanics. I did a little word analysis, and it was about 315, 320-ish words of a 1,400-word review that were dedicated to criticizing the main character as sexist. Now, if we compare that to the way Dragon's Crown did it, that was a 1,150-word review, and about 200 of those words were related to sexism. But they were certainly a little bit more nuanced, because they also described the protagonists as being powerful women with agency. It wasn't a broad stroke condemnation, whereas frankly, Arthur Geese's review of Bayonetta 2 is very much that. Now, that doesn't mean the majority of the review is dominated by that particular discussion. Statistically, it is not, as you can see. It's about 20% of it, but he leads with it in a really, really big way. He dedicates a great deal of time at the start of it before ever describing any of the game mechanics whatsoever to this particular notion. And it's unfortunate that they didn't use a box out for that, because I think it would be very interesting. Not only that, but the problem I have is that it's a very, very one-sided piece of critique. There is no effort whatsoever to place yourself outside of the shoes of someone that holds this particular opinion. And here's the big problem when discussing contentious things like sexism. They're not objective, they're incredibly subjective, and Bayonetta's a prime example. This is a character that's lauded by many, many sex-positive feminists as being a strong character with agency that fully owns her sexuality and needs no help from anybody, least of all any man. And then we have the other side, who I suppose you would describe as sex-negative, describing this particular character as being nothing more than a fighting fuck toy for men, and subscribing to the male gaze theory. Now, Arthur Geese absolutely subscribes to the male gaze theory, there's no doubt. He talks about the camera very much so as zooming in on Bayonetta's parts like they're products being sold in a commercial. There are enough gratuitous ass shots, cleavage jokes, and spread legs to fill an hours-long supercut. The camera doesn't look at Bayonetta, it leers at her. He goes on to claim that this is actually an implicit reward for doing well. I find that argument to be somewhat unjustified. The reviewer seems to understand that the lore behind the game is that Bayonetta's supernatural power is tied into her hair, as he says. Her clothing is actually composed of the hair magic. As she's performing more powerful attacks, more of the hair magic is diverted from covering her to compensate. Which is, of course, very, very true. However, he then goes on to say, that's sexist, gross pandering, and totally unnecessary. Now, the problem with that statement is that, again, it's very authoritative. It's very much saying, this is sexist. It's flat out saying, this is sexist, gross, there's that word again, gross, pandering, and totally unnecessary. These are very strong words, and when I read the rest of the review, that's very much what dominates it for me, and I think that the debate really kicked in when people read the score, because the rest of the review has barely any criticism of the game whatsoever. I mean, it's extremely, extremely minor stuff. Indeed, in the conclusion, he describes it as being better than the original in almost every respect, and the original was lauded as an extremely good game. Myself, I claimed that it was the best spectacle fighter to exist. It was peerless in the genre. Edge magazine gave it 10 out of 10, which they don't give to all that many games. They would hardly be the only one to do so. It got universally positive reviews, at least on Xbox. It didn't on PlayStation, but that was for port reasons more so than anything else. It's a shame that Polygon didn't review the first Bayonetta that I could then compare it to. But then we have the ending score being 7.5. Now, you know what would be nice? Is if we took that score away. That would actually be kind of fantastic, because here's the thing I know about scores, the way that Polygon does them. I actually did speak to Philip Collar, who is one of the review editors over there, and they stated that the score was actually crafted by a few people, not just by the reviewer, and indeed, they attempted to disconnect the written text from the score itself. But that just doesn't really make a great deal of sense in the context of the Bayonetta 2 review, which has really no other criticism whatsoever. Everything else about this is positive, across the board. Everything he's written, with the exception of that one complaint. And as a result, it's very difficult to disconnect the complaint of sexism, which is a very subjective complaint, and that particular political review point from the score. Now, what's the harm, you might ask, in giving a score to a game based on your specific political viewpoint? Well, the problem is Metacritic. I'm going to be entirely honest with you. Metacritic strips away all semblance of context. And I think that on its own, while I personally would have written this differently, I would have either boxed it out, or I would have made an effort to discuss the other side of the argument, of which there has been a great deal written by many people, including feminists, the idea that Bayonetta is a very strong female character with agency and full control of her sexuality. It would be great to see a discussion in that regard. And of course, you can come to a conclusion, but it's nice to see the other side represented in a review like this. I think that's even more important when your review represents the website, and that's the problem with Metacritic. This is Polygon's review score, it's not Arthur Gee's review score. If I go to Metacritic right now and I look up that review, is it going to even mention that Arthur Geese was involved? No, it's not. This is the Polygon review, and it's broken down into 2 sentences and a score. What's worse is the score doesn't even represent the score that Polygon gave it. Metacritic gives it a 75, whereas Polygon uses a 10 out of 10 scale, and a 7.5. These do not mean the same thing, and it gets worse when you see sites like Giant Bomb using a 5-star system, and then along comes Metacritic and says, oh, 5 stars equals 100%, which it's not even remotely the same thing. The review scale is completely and totally busted, because it means different things to different websites, and if Metacritic didn't exist and wasn't so damn influential, then this wouldn't be a problem, but it does exist, and as a result, when you're giving a score, you unfortunately have to give it in the context of a world where Metacritic is influential. And that sucks. Reviewers shouldn't have to do it, but that's just the way of it right now, and as a result, we see scores skewed for a wide variety of different reasons. I mean, Metacritic is problematic for a number of reasons, not least of which the reliance of some people on it. We're talking about a website that deliberately weights certain websites in terms of their contribution to the overall Metacritic score on a particular product, and does not reveal what those weightings are, and can arbitrarily change them behind closed doors whenever they like for no apparent reason. There's also the issue that some studios have missed out on monetary bonuses from their publisher as a result of not getting the right Metacritic score. Now, there's no question that this is an absolutely awful practice from publishers, and frankly, it should be publishers that are dealing with this, but there's not much that we can really do about that, unfortunately, as consumers or in the games media, especially since more often than not we don't know about these agreements. They're buried deep within contracts, sometimes under non-disclosure agreements. But what we could do as games media, and indeed as games consumers, is to abandon the notion that a score is useful, because frankly it is not. Scores take away from the writing, which is why I'm very surprised that traditional games media writers embrace the score as much as they do. No one's talking about the rest of Arthur Geese's review, they're talking about those few paragraphs and that score. Because those are the two things that they associate together. And it causes controversy, it causes drama, it's completely and totally unnecessary. The opinion of Arthur Geese at this point represents the opinion of Polygon regarding Bayonetta 2, because that's what Metacritic and Game Rankings and everything says. I mean, it's the Polygon review. It's not Arthur Geese's review, it's the Polygon review. I suppose it's a little bit weird because I operate in a world where most of my peers and colleagues are single-person YouTube personalities. Some of them have groups of people that work on a channel, but the vast majority of us, well, it's just us. And when people come to our channel, they expect our opinion and really nothing else. Whereas when you go to a website, you're going to be confronted by a staff. There are going to be a number of reviewers there, but they only release, usually, one review per title. And that review is meant to represent the entire website, which is why I found the whole thing to just be a little bit weird. Maybe that's something that will eventually change. Maybe these sites will die out. Maybe more people will go down the Jim Sterling model of becoming independent. When he was writing his reviews, those were the escapists' reviews. Well, now that's not really true. These are now Jim Sterling's reviews. You could argue they were Jim Sterling's reviews all along, but those are the reviews that are published on the website. Those are the reviews that are published on Metacritic. It is the escapists' review, whether you wish to escape from that or not. It's difficult to separate the two. And that's a shame, because I think the real advantage of having a site that has a lot of different personalities involved in it is that you can provide reviews from more than one perspective. It doesn't have to be several full reviews. I'm not suggesting that you get 4 people to review the same game, but if you have your primary upfront reviewer that writes the majority of the review, you can still have either box outs from other people that also played the title, or just from parts from other staff members that you can use to provide a contrasting opinion. I think that's a wonderful way of dealing with an issue like, say, Bayonetta being sexist. Does all of Polygon agree with that particular point of view? Well, I don't know, because I've only heard Arthur Geese's opinion on that particular matter. So that to me is a missed opportunity. And missed opportunities are always going to hurt the consumer in the long run. You want to provide a variety of opinions so that the consumer is well informed. And it would be a wonderful discussion to have, but it's not had. And if it's not had, I find it difficult to justify its presence in the review. Either try and present it from more than one point of view, or just don't talk about it, because the opinion comes across as so ridiculously authoritative. It doesn't say it might be sexist, or to some people this is going to appear sexist. It says it's sexist. It's as simple as that. It makes an authoritative statement. I think where possible you should try and avoid that on anything that's not very easy to prove by simply looking at objective facts. The frame rate debate, you can point to facts and say, look, this is how it is, these are the benefits. It's very difficult to argue against it. With something like this, it's very, very open to interpretation, and if there is the appearance that your review has been so influenced by your particular political slant, then some people are not going to be particularly happy with it. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't read it. You know, I would not avoid Polygon's reviews because they said they had a progressive way of looking at things, whatever that might mean. I don't know what that means, frankly, because progressive seems to mean different things to different people, just as things like social justice mean different things to different people, sexism means different things to different people, and so on and so forth. I'll still read them, because it's wonderful to have that perspective. I'd also like to read them from the perspective of someone who might consider themselves to be socially conservative. That would be very interesting. I'd like to read it from a Christian perspective, an atheist perspective, the perspective of someone that lives in a completely different country with a completely different culture. Those are all very valuable opinions. There was a recent review put out by Eurogamer for the game Never Alone, and it was reviewed by someone who happens to be a Native American. That provided a very interesting perspective, although simultaneously, if you were to look at the score for that, it being a 10 out of 10, you could probably easily make the argument that, well, this game resonated more with this person than it would with your regular average Joe because of his heritage. But the cool thing is, this is what makes this review, frankly, in my opinion, better than Arthur Geese's review of Bayonetta, is that he gives context to everything he's saying. And that is hugely valuable to the consumer. Wear the biases on the sleeve, and then I can look at it relative with my experiences, and I can compare and contrast, and that gives me so much more information than somebody preaching from the rooftop saying, this is sexist, this is horrible, or some bollocks about Glade plugins. Ultimately, you can write a review in any way you so choose. There's nothing I can do to stop anybody from doing that, and I shouldn't be able to either. They have freedom of speech. It's as simple as that. I shouldn't be trying to muzzle that. But I do believe that perhaps some of them could maybe improve just a little bit when it comes to looking from different perspectives. And that particular criticism can always be pointed at me as well. We are all, of course, very vulnerable to having our minds clouded by our own personal biases. That's going to happen whether we wanted to or not, but being self-aware and being self-reflective, I think, is the best way to become better at what we do. It's always important to realize that as a reviewer, a critic, or anything else, we hold a lot of power, audience, and influence. And yet we're only one person, one mind. And there are so many more ideas and perspectives and different mindsets out there that, frankly, if we want to be successful, we might want to try and cater to every once in a while. That's not pandering. That's empathy. So many of the things we say when it comes to critique can't really be right or wrong. That's a wonderful little privilege that we happen to have as reviewers and critics and so on and so forth. Our opinions can't necessarily be wrong, unless, of course, they're based in falsehood. But that doesn't mean we should always assume that they're right either. Let me set out my ideal dream world here when it comes to games critique, and I don't like to give critique without also giving constructive criticism and providing what are, in my opinion, some solutions to the problem. Metacritic disappears tomorrow and websites stop giving scores to anything. The benefits of this are obvious. They involve the viewer actually having to read or watch the particular piece of critique and comprehend what is being said in and of itself within the context of the review. Scores take away all context. Scores are meaningless, arbitrary nonsense. They don't need to be there, and they encourage a lazy attitude which is, frankly, obsessive when it comes to dealing with arbitrary numbers and causes untold number of completely unnecessary and pointless arguments. We can get rid of that. That could disappear if scores went the way of the dodo. If scores went the way of the dodo, Metacritic itself would not have any influence within this particular industry. And I think that getting rid of scores on the games media side of things is much more realistic than telling Metacritic to bog off. Secondly, reviews would stop making so many authoritative statements without considering other possibilities. Staff with multiple staff members would utilize their particular range of opinions, viewpoints, and expertise to craft a review that would approach particular issues from multiple points of view, leaving room still for the primary reviewer to come up with a conclusion, but providing a podium for different potential viewpoints that the viewer may very well be able to relate to. This overall, I think, would increase the usefulness of the review to the consumer. And finally, subjects like this are absolutely fantastic opportunities for editorial or op-ed. So why not do that? As opposed to shoehorning in the issue in, quite frankly, too few words to give justice to a very specific and complex set of arguments. Why not give these issues the time in the sun that they deserve? This to me is frankly better because, as I've said before, clearly labeled content is pro-consumer and is going to attract a particular audience. The key mistake that some people seem to make implicitly is believing that the entire audience are all coming to a review for the same reasons. My name's been TotalBiscuit, talking a little bit about reviews. I'll see you next time.